Okay, everybody, it's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another reminder to sign up for the Skeptic Society, Skeptic Magazine public event we're having this year, December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, Friday night, all day Saturday, Saturday night fundraising dinner, Sunday with Jared Diamond. And so I just wanted to say, just in kind of reflection, we have not had a public event in many, many years. Our last big conference was at Caltech back in 2015. Time frame. And since then, of course, as you know, we had the pandemic that shut everything down. We moved our offices from Altadena up to Santa Barbara, where I now live. And so we've had kind of a restructuring, and I want to share all that with you by showing you the office. You can just come on in. I've got thousands of books in my private library here, as well as you'll be able to pick up back issues of Skeptic. They're right there on the wall, most of which we keep in print. Copies of my books and other books by people like Richard Dawkins and Jared Diamond and so forth. It's going to be an epic weekend. I'm really looking forward to it. We really depend on your support. The Skeptic Society is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization that depends on donations and fundraising events like this. So much of this event, much of the money for this event goes to the Skeptic Society. Well, none of it goes to me or anyone personally, but to the Skeptic Society. That's what that Saturday night fundraising dinner is all about. And if you support the magazine, our work, and the media, the podcast, and so on and so forth, everything we've been doing for 31 years now, then you can show your support by coming, just coming. And why would you not want to come to Santa Barbara in December? Believe me, it's gorgeous here. And the hotel where we're holding it at, the Hilton, is right on the beach, right on Cabrillo. You will be, 30 feet from the sand. It's great. It's a wonderful facility, and I've talked them into some great low prices, like half the price you'd pay to stay there if you just walked in off the street. So check it out. Go to skeptic.com, click on the banner for our conference, sign up for the event, sign up for the Saturday night fundraising dinner. I'll see you here that Friday night or Sunday afternoon at the office where I'm sitting now, and at the events at the Hilton. It's going to be epic. All right. See you soon. Okay, let's start with the basics. Cancel culture, what is it? How do you define it?
Sure. We define it, we want to kind of establish it as a historical era, basically the same way people talk about other mass censorship incidents, in history, like the Red Scare or one and two. We link it, we basically say it's the uptick after 2014 of campaigns, to get people deplatformed, punished, expelled, fired, etc., for opinions that would be otherwise protected by the First Amendment if it were happening like in a public setting. And also the climate of fear and conformity that resulted from that. Right.
Rikki, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say in terms of our definition, it is a little bit technical, but at least for me, it was something that I just grew up so steeped in that it was a strange exercise to even really define it in such a specific way, because 2014 is our cutoff point of where I think it really took on a new tone. But I was born in 2000, and so as far as my contextual chronological awareness, that's pretty much all I've known is this graceless society in which any little misstep or faux pas could cost you a friendship or a college admissions letter. It's definitely, it's strange because that cutoff point is very, very much in line with when I came into political awareness myself.
Well, what's funny about this, Rikki, is it makes perfect sense that you were like, well, I lived with this my whole life. And why did we notice such a change in 2015 or 2014? It's because Gen Z started hitting college because there was a little blip in cancel culture that's measurable around 2011. That's kind of like the social media effect, like all over, so that's kind of like the precursors, like Martin Gurry's whole point. But you grew up with it, but then it started reaching the whole country when Gen Z started hitting campus in large numbers, unfortunately.
Yeah. Let me introduce you to what I call the Henny Youngman principle. Henny Youngman was a 1950s comedian. He used to joke around. One of his lines was when he was asked, "How's your wife?" He said, "Compared to what?" So cancel culture is much worse. Really? Compared to what? How do you know?
We have a lot of data in the book. And particularly, I've been working on campuses now for 22 years. And to be clear, it wasn't great when I started in 2001. But for example, we compared historical data on the number of professors who've been targeted. And we talk about more than 1,000 examples of professors being targeted since 2014. 2/3 of those have been punished in some way, and about a fifth of those, almost 200 of them, have been fired, and that includes like 40 tenured professors. So it's a big number. Now, to put that in historical perspective, I started during 9/11, and there was major threats to academic freedom in the years after 9/11, and there were about over a dozen professors targeted, and 3 of them lost their jobs. And that was considered really bad, even though the 3 professors who lost their jobs, one was Ward Churchill, who ultimately lost it because of academic misconduct, which was serious. Another one for taking too much time out of class to talk about, in that case, the Iraq War. Another one who was fired, Samuel Arian, because of they were like, okay, he does seem to actually have ties to terrorism. And that was really, like, since the law was established between 1957 and 1973, there's nothing even close to the number of professors that we see. We even compare it back to the Red Scare. Even though the law wasn't clear yet, people in the 50s actually thought you could fire communists because they were too politically doctrinaire and not good teachers, was basically the rationale. And at the time, there was actually a massive study going on of the Red Scare. And they estimated about 62, 63 professors were fired for communist beliefs, about 90 professors for beliefs overall during that period, which is usually rounded up to 100. And we're talking about twice that number, except in a time where there's almost no viewpoint diversity on campus. There's a million different ways people get canceled without anybody even being able to see it, because there are literally secret hearings. And you're still able to find this many heretics to burn. It's insane.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we were so fortunate that I think I speak for myself and a lot of other people where I felt like I had so much anecdata to say, like, oh, I know a ton of people who've been torn down and attacked, but we were super fortunate to have the fire team behind us and all of these amazing statistics that they were able to distill for us. And they've have decades of caseloads to demonstrate that there truly is an explosion, first like around the 2016 election, and then again, like unprecedented numbers in 2020, which I think really, like, one thing I keep hearing is people saying like, oh, isn't this kind of behind us and in the rearview mirror? But it seems like I'd probably be likely to say that in 2018, not knowing that the pandemic and this next level of unrest and this next contentious point in history was right around the corner. And I wouldn't be surprised if the 2024 election doesn't become another cycle of, at this point in time, it seems like if we have a cultural tension point, our reflexive response is to just indulge in a liberalism in this really frightening way.
Yeah. Yeah. So anecdotal data versus actual data. And I guess it just depends on what the context is. The story I like to tell is, toggling between CNN and Fox News and who was it, Hannity or whoever had the campus craziness segment every week. And, if you watch that, you just think, well, every college campus must be completely nuts. And before COVID, I was doing maybe a dozen to 24 public talks at universities and colleges through an agency that would book me. And you go to these college campuses and you don't see anything. I mean, it's just these kind of quiet, bucolic places where students are mostly just holed up in their dorms or at the Starbucks. And, you don't see these, sort of campus riots and craziness. So, and at Chapman, where I taught for 12 years, you almost never see anything like that. So is it that even if the actual raw numbers are low, it doesn't take that many incidences to get a spiral of silence going where everybody has to feel like they need to keep their mouth shut?
Well, and to be clear, historically speaking, the numbers aren't low. And when you actually ask professors whether or not they've been punished or threatened with punishment, we did a big study on this. 16%. I thought it would be like 2% would say.
Wow,
because that would, because 2% would be really bad. So we know that we're like, even that the 1,000, which is a terrible number, and we can't find any comparison in the last 50 years. That's just a tip of the iceberg. But it is also really clear, and I had to explain this very nicely at a presentation I did in Boston with someone being skeptical that, it couldn't possibly be that the elite colleges are really that much worse. And I'm like, I almost want to be like, oh, no, dear, I'm so sorry. Yes, they are. They are a lot worse. There are a lot more professors losing their jobs. I mean, Harvard was horrified that it finished dead last in our campus free speech ranking. And they were kind of like, this can't be, like basically this must be ridiculous. And I'm like, no, you have to understand. You got a negative 10.69. The next closest school was University of Pennsylvania, which has been terrible for free speech, also an Ivy League school, that got like 11. And some of the criticisms of our ranking of Harvard, so they got so Harvard about it. Like one of them was kind of like, well, the methodology is not good. We know the best statisticians in the world. I'm like, well, you should know that Sam Abrams, a Harvard PhD in statistics, who's brilliant, is one of the main people who conducted the study. It's the largest survey of student attitudes ever conducted, and that we base it on 4 databases. The biggest one of professor cancellations, of student cancellations, of deplatforming, and of speech codes. So it's like it's on a bigger scale than ever it's been done. And one of the other arguments that Harvard was making was that some of the professors we were holding against them for firing or otherwise disciplining weren't that prestigious of professors. And it's like, oh, dude, okay, that's ridiculous. That's just snobbery talking. But by the way, even if we took away those professors, which we shouldn't because they matter, you would still be dead last.
Yeah, I remember seeing Pinker posted from Harvard, we're number 1.
Pinker is great. Pinker's been a real champion on his campus too. He started up a whole movement to improve the environment there.
So just for listeners, the references to your appendix here, where you have the data that you actually present here of your college rankings from 1 to whatever it is, 203, Columbia University at 9.91, University of Chicago at 77.92. So these are self-report data from students and professors of how they're treated on college campuses.
Greg, you're muted.
We do 13 different factors, and with the students, we ask a number of questions, and we evaluate them. So if you have a school where all of the liberals think it's great for free speech and none of the conservatives do, that's a bigger penalty, because it basically means that like there's definitely viewpoint discrimination going on there. We also factor in things like whether or not they say the faculty will have their back, whether or not they think the environment is good. So it's been interesting to see, I live in D.C. and Howard University actually came out as the best school in D.C. It's still like in the 80s out of 200. The survey you're talking about was actually last year's because we couldn't. The new survey was just too new. There was no way we could actually get it in the new book. So we wanted people to have some perspective by seeing the previous years. But they came off at like number 4 for in terms of comfort expressing ideas, which was really interesting to see. So we evaluate the student rank, the students on all different sorts of things. The most disturbing stuff, though, is tolerance for violence. And at Oberlin, for example, only around half of the students said violence is never okay in response to speech. And we've noticed that a really weirdly high percentage of former women's colleges have populations that actually, think blocking a speaker is okay, shouting down a speaker is okay, or even violence in response to speech, which is some of the most disturbing stuff I've seen in my career.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I was an undergraduate, 72 to 76. You must have been about 10 years behind me, Greg. And Rikki, you were what, 2010s for college?
I showed up in 2018. Yeah.
Okay.
1992.
Right.
That was when I started college.
Yeah. Okay, 1992. Okay, boy, I'm really old. All right. Well, so I do remember the concept of political correctness and some of my more conservative professors complaining about this. Is what we're going through now qualitatively different than the political correctness movement, or is it just more of the same?
It's definitely a much more intense version of it. I wrote a long piece for Reason last year called "The Second Great Age of Political Correctness," and I talk about how you went from the speech code movement of '64 to the anti-free speech movement of Herbert Marcuse in 1965. And even though free speech kind of won the day on campus, or so we thought, by 1985, major campuses, including Wisconsin, Stanford, University of Michigan, started passing speech codes to clamp down on racist, sexist speech. But then, of course, many of these schools, the first people to get in trouble were actually minorities themselves. So, it worked out exactly the way a free speech person would tell you it would work out. And at the time, though, this was kind of off campus. The right and the left thought that PC was ridiculous. It was worthy of being made fun of. Speech codes were an abomination, and they were all defeated from 89 to 95. But a big point of my of that article is that I started working around 2001, and actually it turns out that there were more speech codes on campus in 2001 than there were even in 1995. They just kind of ignored the rulings. And that even though the students were less enamored with PC and the professors were less enamored with PC, the administration, which kept on growing, the administrators, were definitely much more hostile to freedom of speech. And it took a wave of students also being comparatively hostile to freedom of speech showing up around 2013, 2014 to create something that is a much bigger, calamity in terms of academic freedom, conformity, free speech in a university with much lower viewpoint diversity than it had back in the 80s. And with things like bias-related incident programs that didn't exist back then, which have replaced speech codes to a large degree, where you can call and report your professors or your friends for offensive speech.
Yeah, and
Rikki,
on
give
that
us some
note,
examples of give us some examples for your experience.
yeah, absolutely. This is a story that I tell often because I think it's just the first moment of me on campus that's pretty illustrative of my experience while at NYU. I showed up, I just moved to the city, and they have you go to campus police building to get your ID card so that you can get into all the buildings. And they hand it to you and they say, this gets you into the cafeteria and here and there. And then on the back, you'll find all the really important phone numbers for being an NYU student. And it's, of course, 911's on the top. The campus safety hotline is there in case there's a crime. I mean, it's Lower Manhattan. The student health center, I think there's a phone number for a psychological help hotline, which frankly is very necessary for Gen Zers. And then after that, there's the bias response hotline on the back of your ID card. So it can never stray from your person because just in case you need to report a transgression, it's there. We had posters all over campus. They were on the back of the bathroom stalls oftentimes, like in the library and stuff. And so, it was institutionalized in a way of I had come from a boarding school where I was used to a lot of the arguments against free speech, and I was aware that there was an issue in terms of self-censorship. I mean, I already had experienced that in high school, but then arriving in college and saying oh yeah, first day, better make sure that there's a hotline to report any transgressors. I mean, I was very, very nervous as a more heterodox thinking person on NYU's campus. And I was hiding. This is embarrassing to say in retrospect, but I'm in this dorm with randomly assigned NYU students who I just assume were hostile to my viewpoint or could be. And I wanted to have friends living in the city alone. So I had hid my Thomas Sowell books and my Jordan Peterson books under my bed, which is so embarrassing in retrospect. And now they're on wide open display behind me as we speak. But that was the kind of place that I was.
Books in a brown paper bag.
Exactly. God forbid anyone knew that I believed that there were some economic fallacies out there in the world. But
on that, just as a sidebar, identity politics, where identity is just everything, your race is everything. But Thomas Sowell is black, so apparently that's not enough, right? It's an interactive
then he's a race
effect.
traitor. We talk about this in the one thing that I think is cool about the book is we try to situate cancel culture as only the most extreme way of winning arguments without winning arguments. And we take on what we call rhetorical fortresses on the right and the left. The right one we call the efficient because it's just very simple. It's like you don't have to listen to liberals, experts, journalists, or people that don't like Trump. But on the left, since it grew up in academia, it's just like level after level of ways to not ever have to address someone's argument. And step number one that I confess, and with profound embarrassment, that when I started at Stanford in '97. If you could do the game of claiming that some author or thinker was conservative, that very quickly did lead to a sort of I guess I don't have to take them that seriously. And so it took me a long time to read Thomas Sowell, for example, who I was like, oh wow, this guy's freaking brilliant. And he does his most controversial thing is he oftentimes will do an international comparison of problems facing the United States with other countries. And then of course, the funniest one was Camille Paglia. I had somehow been persuaded that she was some kind of crazy right winger when she's more of a crazy left winger, but she's a badass and she's a totally interesting thinker. And it's not just that the 36% of people that are actually call themselves conservatives can be dismissed. It's like what Pinker's point about the left pole, that higher education is so uniformly left that everything to them looks like it's to the right.
Is there a right pole where everything to the left looks, everything away looks left, far left?
I I think that when it comes to some of the stuff that we point out where the problems are with the liberalism, it's been in some of the state legislatures. But given that there's that when you look at the breakdown of the country, that more densely populated places tend to be more left-leaning and more sparsely populated people tend to be the right. I think that outside of some very religious colleges, like I'm not sure you could find a place that would actually be as bad as having like a right pole.
Mm.
I mean, perhaps not like a geographical location, but I mean, I definitely see as someone like I'm a center right libertarian and I write for more conservative outlets and I'll get comments and feedback calling me woke often. And I'm like, I mean, in my context in Lower Manhattan, I'm hardly woke, but I think that's one of those words that people use to just point out any sort of like if you are in a really purist area of the right wing ideologically, that's a word that you can just kind of throw at anyone to dismiss them in a similarly dismissive way, which I mean, I guess on the online sense, that is a right poll.
Right. Since you mentioned Jordan Peterson, well, actually, one comment on Thomas Sowell. He just has a new book out, Social Justice
Yes.
Fallacies.
Yeah.
It's called.
And he's 93, right?
I know he's not doing any podcasts, so I didn't get to have him. But he makes like one point of this, compared to what my Henny Youngman example, that there's the black-white income difference largely disappears if you control for marriage and college education and so on. So he makes a kind of snarky remark. So I guess the racists are just targeting single black people and uneducated black people or something. In other words, thinking like a social scientist where you have like a dozen variables at work that may account for some discrepancy. And your people that you're writing about, the cancel culture people, they're just looking at the one variable, maybe two, race and gender. Race and gender.
And we do take on cancel culture from the right as well.
Yeah.
We have multiple chapters on that, and we're concerned about it. But it has been interesting, debating this in public. And when it comes to, I feel like there are people who want me to say it's all worse on the right. And I'm like, that would be lying. Like looking at what's going on in academia. So, for example, even in the data I just cited, about 1/3 of those cases of professors being targeted, they actually initially come from the right. But and then sometimes Turning Point USA, sometimes Fox News, and some of those professors really do get punished. But there is a caveat there. Almost all of those campuses are still dominated by the left. So the ultimate person who decided to fire that professor oftentimes is someone who would be considered on the left. And so I did a debate many years ago. If the left, and I still consider myself left of center liberal, that if the left was still as good on free speech as it was in, say, the 1970s, none of this stuff would be possible because even if it was a liberal or conservative professor getting in trouble, they would just answer, no, we're not punishing this person for their expression or academic freedom. That's insane.
That's funny. Yeah, Chapman University, it's pretty liberal. The faculty is pretty liberal, but we have statues around campus of like Ayn Rand and Margaret Thatcher and Martin Luther King and just a variety of people. And at one point, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, there was a demand that these statues be taken down. I mean, Ayn Rand, oh my gosh, Margaret Thatcher, she's practically a war criminal and so on. Anyway, but our president handled this just perfectly. He waited a few days and then issued a statement. I listened to what you said. I respect your opinions, but no, we're not taking the statues down. And it was like, and then they just went away. It's like, oh, so if you just stand up to them, then they go off in search of somebody else.
You are so right. And that's one of the things that we do try to stress in terms of solutions. One, like if you're a corporation, have a policy like, we don't, we have due process in place. Like as long as you slow the process down, the social media mob won't last. And when it comes to campuses, a university president who comes out early and says no, how quickly that can make a incident dissolve. And that's one of the things that the good schools actually have in common, the ones who do well on our campus free speech ranking. And including University of Chicago generally has been quite good on it. UVA is probably are the most the most elite, but then a lot of technical colleges make it on the top of the list because they can fall back on some things are true and some things aren't, and it's not always going to be nice.
Hey Ricky, because I get asked about Jordan Peterson a lot since I know him, and I've written a little bit about him. What is the appeal of his message, do you think? Why is he so huge?
I mean, he was appealing to me. I always hear that he's the king of the incels, and all his followers are young, sad, pathetic men. And I don't feel that that really is a descriptor of myself. I've always found his 12 Rules for Life. I think I read it like late high school, I would say, and it it's funny because I remember at one point recommended it to my mom, who's a very common sense thinker, and she read it and she was like, Rikki, like, this is pretty, like, I thought that I taught you this stuff. Like, this is pretty basic, like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, clean your room, get your life in order sort of thing. But I think for someone as a member of Gen Z, it was like really an antidote to this pervasive message of like, you are a victim. And if something goes wrong, your locus of control is outside of you. It's because you're a woman, or it's because of whatever immutable characteristic you might be able to claim you're being targeted by, that the world is working against you. And I really felt that that was like the victimhood complex that a lot of Gen Zers grow up steeped in, that was so pervasive on places like Tumblr and social media, that all my friends and I basically grew up on and derived our social philosophy from, unfortunately, in retrospect. Like, just having that very clear voice of wisdom saying, get your shit together, get your ducks in a row and then take on the world, was to me something that it wasn't a message that I ever really heard. And it was funny to me when my mom was like, I thought that I taught you this. I'm like, I don't know. Tumblr taught me that everyone is out to get me. And if someone doesn't hold the door for me, it's got to be because I'm a woman or something like that.
All right, maybe this is a good point to introduce, Rikki, the three great untruths from the previous book, Coddling the American Mind, and then your new fourth great untruth that you talk about in this book.
Sure. The great untruths come from actually the way my family tends to give advice. That essentially we recognize that we're independent minded, the kind of people who would end up at the head of a free speech organization. We like to think for ourselves, but so we don't think that people often respond to positive advice saying you should do the following 5 things. All we're trying to do usually is like, but don't do the following. Don't do this dumb thing. Can we all agree on that? So the setup for Coddling of the American Mind, the book that actually is why Rikki and I know each other in the first place, we had 3 great untruths, which is what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, to always trust your feelings, and life is a battle between good people and evil people. And we make the point that if you believe these things, your life will not be as happy. It goes against modern psychology and ancient wisdom, and it's just terrible advice to give to anyone. The one that sounds the nicest is always trust your feelings, but most of like actual moral teaching is about no. Goodness, no! Don't always trust your feelings. They're information, not instructions. I can't remember her name, but that's one of my favorite quotes on that. And in this book, we added a 4th great untruth, which is no bad person has any good opinion. That essentially, so much of the debate seems to be trying to establish whether or not that someone is morally good or bad. And that's actually where the conservative part comes in, because like really what they're trying to say is like this person's conservative and therefore immoral because they're all bad. And therefore you don't have to listen to them. And there's something really childish about this. Now, I always think of like, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All the biographies of Rousseau show him to be a pretty awful human being. That doesn't mean he's wrong about everything. And actually, I'd say that there's maybe 40% of Rousseau that I actually quite agree with. You shouldn't actually be evaluating thinkers on whether or not you think they're good people. You should be evaluating them on their argument. But there's also a huge double standard. They don't tend to apply this to Rousseau because there's some affection for Rousseau still on the left. But the great David Hume, which I say with such great reverence because every science person and every First Amendment person loves him so. He had a footnote in I think 1752 that was by modern standards racist. He also had a footnote in 1752, and there's an attempt to completely dismiss him. Whereas Douglas Murray points out, it's like, by the way, they don't do this with Marx, who was racist, anti-Semitic, like all of this kind of horrible stuff. There's a huge double standard with who they apply the, no bad people can have any good opinion.
What's that you call that offense archaeology, where you go digging around?
To be clear, that's not our term. I don't remember who originally came up with it. I know I should learn to give credit where it's due. But my favorite example of offense archaeology was he was on the board of directors, I think, of a major corporation. And he had written against women being in the military in like 1986 or somewhere around there. And he got canceled. He got kicked off the board because of something he had written in the 80s, which by the way he no longer even believed in, and he was very clear about that. So that's the thing. What we're trying to say is, and one of the reasons why I got so frankly depressed and anxious when I was writing this book, is as soon as you're a target, the thing they're going to get you on isn't necessarily the thing you're saying on the podcast. It's something that you might have tweeted, 15 years ago. It might be a column you wrote in high school. It might the ability to try to find something on you is one of the MOs of cancel culture.
Yeah. Rikki, you talked about in the book, you guys talk about the difference between the First Amendment as legal precedents and then just cultural free speech norms. What's wrong with, well, okay, let's put it this way. I can't just say anything I want walking around the world telling people you're fat and ugly or whatever. I mean, we all silence ourselves out of politeness or whatever. Isn't that different from whatever the First Amendment protects us? And shouldn't corporations and universities have something like polite speech codes or, don't be a dick and just say nasty things to people? What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's the First Amendment that protects you in the public sphere, and then it's certainly up to private corporations and private universities to create their own contours. And I think, I mean, there is, in my opinion, I think there's a great deal of mistrust in people's ability to just filter on their own. Like, I don't think a corporation necessarily needs to say Michael can't call his coworker fat. I think that most people can kind of do that on their own without their corporation stepping in and doing that. But one delineation that we do make is that we don't think that First Amendment law on its own is adequate in protecting free speech in a culture, because you have examples of contrasting examples of the French Enlightenment, which was able to flourish in a context in which the laws in the books were actually quite hostile to free speech, and yet that was an enormous moment of intellectual flourishing, versus if you go to a country like Turkey or North Korea or Russia, in a legal sense, you actually have a perfectly fine standard of having free expression, but that just doesn't actually happen in actuality. And I think that the reason that we delineate between free speech culture and just free speech laws in the books is because it's truly, you can't have a society where free speech is thriving and healthy and well, and discourse is robust, unless it's a principle that is drilled into every citizen's head and something that they truly believe in, that knowing what other people really believe and have to say is something worth knowing. And I mean, I would say, even just from my own personal perspective, coming from Gen Z, being a philosophy major, I did a 2-year liberal arts condensed philosophy program at NYU at a great school. I was at the top of my class. And yet it took the pandemic and taking a leave of absence to decide on my own that I wanted to read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And I had this I mean, it's hard for me to even it's like learning to ride a bicycle. Like, now I can't really think about what the world is like without the realization of what classical liberalism is. But at that moment in time, it was like, whoa, like it just hit me. Like, I've been taking for granted all this time what free speech means to a society, how I do actually have these amazing rights that are so historically and chronologically unlikely in the scheme of human history. But it took actually learning about why that principle matters, and not just taking it for granted and saying oh, maybe some offensive speech should just be curbed because I don't want to hurt people's feelings. You need people to be aware of why we've all bought into this classical liberal ideal, and just having a law in the books is certainly not enough to guarantee that.
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in because we actually put some of the more in the weeds arguments back in the appendix, partially because since most people kind of know cancel culture is going, we didn't want to have the in the weeds arguments break up the flow of the main argument, so we put them a little bit in the back. But I make the point that one of the reasons why we include the First Amendment standards in the definition of cancel culture is to import a tremendous amount of thoughtfulness and nuance that actually exists in First Amendment law. And so, for example, when you talk about the employment setting, I tend to think of it as a analog or comparison to public employee status. Now, what that means, at least in theory, is that yeah, you call your coworker fat, in the office, that's considered, unprofessional, and any employer, government or not, could probably fire you for that. They might also be kind of like, okay, that's rude, stop being rude. I don't like the fact that the first thing people seem to do is get fired these days, but that's a totally different issue. But if you express your opinion off the job on a matter of public concern, there is some law saying that that a public employee shouldn't be fired for having an opinion. And when you're talking about things like free speech culture versus free speech law, you're really talking about thumbs on the scale and different levels of balancing. And at the end, we point out that there already are like sayings that we all grew up with, or at least not so much Ricky, but me and you grew up with, like to each their own. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. All of these things that kind of put a little bit of a thumb on the scale of, okay, do I really want to fire this person for cracking a bawdy joke on Twitter, for example, which really does happen. Or should I be kind of like, well, if everyone did that, if every corporation did that, that would be bad for democracy, right?
Right. Yeah, Ricky, so you grew up in the social media world. And so I'm curious how a libertarian like you thinks about the regulation of social media companies. Shouldn't they? I mean, if you're a pro free market, shouldn't Twitter be able to do whatever they want? Corporation. I mean, they used to have shareholders, but I guess not anymore. But something like that, Facebook or whatever, that's their prerogative. They can ban whoever they want. Even though maybe norm-wise you don't think they should, but shouldn't they be able to do that?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think that they certainly should be able to. I think there's some important nuances that have come out of like Jay Bhattacharya recently having a pretty, I think, landmark victory in now 2 court challenges of the Biden administration and several other federal agencies in which he and several other complainants were able to pretty persuasively demonstrate that federal agencies were reaching out to companies like social media companies like Twitter and saying, here's a body of misinformation on your platform, and effectively jawboning them into censoring on their behalf because these large social media companies do have some favorable regulations, and it's like, well, it's a really nice company that you have there with all of your favorable policies. It'd be a shame if you didn't get rid of a little bit of this misinformation for us. So I think that's a very important nuance of defining the boundaries between these companies, which are increasingly just standing in for the public forum and also allowing for some free market alternatives to flourish, which, I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of disruption with Elon Musk buying Twitter and all these different offshoots of now Threads is an option. I don't really think that went anywhere, but there were a few others.
I don't think any of them are going to go anywhere. And there's something about the free market that doesn't solve these kinds of problems just because of market momentum. I mean, why aren't there a dozen Twitters? There aren't. They got there first, and that's it. They captured 99% of the audience. And you can go to Threads, but no one's on Threads. You got to be on Threads. You are? Okay.
I post to Threads, Substack, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram because there's something wrong with me. But
so here I'm giving you the argument, particularly to Ricky, libertarian. The free market is not solving this problem, so government needs to step in and regulate it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, which problem specifically?
Well, I guess censorship. I mean, people should not be free to say whatever they want. I mean, ISIS should not be free to recruit members on Twitter, something like that.
And so the argument would be, I mean, I agree with you, but I also don't think that there's a large swath of social media companies that have just been like warm hosts to ISIS. I do think that the free market has done a pretty good job of stepping up and creating the contours and experimenting rather than the government coming in and saying, here's what is dangerous speech or here's what's not allowed. I mean, I'd much rather allow for that experimentation, and which I think Twitter did, and Elon is trying to tinker with the different nuances there. And I mean, I also would push back a little bit on the idea that the free market has not created some alternatives. I mean, for better or for worse, a place like, it might not be a place that you and I would want to go to, but like Gab and Truth Social and all these other little crevices of the internet that are very much alive and unfortunately very polarized, but like they're there has been a free market alternative that it might be a little bit more of a niche market, but those are pretty dedicated users.
We have a chapter actually on what we think is kind of like primitive thinking on social media. And one thing that's really cool is that we got to work with NCRI, National Contagion Research Institute, to look at data indicating that people who were kicked off of Twitter in 2016 and 2017 and 2020 tended to go to places like Gab, where from the research they did seemed to indicate, and unsurprisingly, got much more radicalized. And what people miss is that there's value in knowing what people really think. So, for example, like when you give the example of terrorists being, kicked off different platforms, I have sympathy for it, but kicking them off. But at the same time, they all moved to WhatsApp. They all moved to things that were much better protected. Meanwhile, it's kind of like, you're gonna tell us what you're planning? Great, like way to create a record, way to do this out in the open. And this is something I have to repeat a lot. Like, it's not, you don't defend freedom of speech because you think everything people say is good. What you defend freedom of speech because you're saying that everything people say is information that might be valuable. They might be announcing, hey, by the way, Nazi over here, great, don't go on a date with me, that they might actually otherwise be hiding.
That's funny. Yeah, when there's all those calls to kick Trump off of Twitter, it's like, why? I want to know what he's thinking at 1 a.m.
It's important to know what he's thinking.
No kidding.
He's president. Okay, let's look at the big picture of censorship. What is it about human nature, do you think, that the default seems to be always to censor other people, whether it's individuals or corporations or government agency? It's just the long history of humanity. Censorship is the norm. Why?
Well, I mean, I call my Substack the eternally radical idea because, and it's a reference to freedom of speech, because I think in every generation people rise up, and people expect I'm going to say to defend free speech. I'm like, no. Every generation people rise up to fight freedom of speech, and they're usually, historically speaking, on the censors are on the winning side. And it's it's a comparatively rare window of human history that free speech has been at all protected. And I think that there's lots of different, reasons for that. I think that certainly tribalism is part of it. I think that we crave certainty. I think that we crave a more rational world. I think we crave, as Karl Popper points out, we crave a more permanent and rational world. But we also like the idea of there being eternal, perfect truths that are unchanging, which is one of the reasons why I'm such a critic of Plato. I give a whole speech, getting a little cranky about Plato. So I think this runs really deep with us. And I think one of the reasons why freedom of speech is the eternally radical idea is because it goes against some of our intuition to say, of course the heavier thing falls faster than the lighter thing. And it actually turns out, wait, my intuition was wrong on that if you test it. That opened up, the Enlightenment was this incredible period of being like, what if we test all this stuff? What if we actually look at it and go like, is this actually true? And we found time and time again, oh, wow, no, we were totally wrong about a million different things when you actually test them. But it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. I think like temperaments like me, you, and Rikki, we have a little bit of we're more comfortable with awe. We like the idea that there's a massive ocean of stuff that we will never and can never know. But for other people, that's profoundly unsettling.
Yeah, Rikki, what is your answer to that based on, say, your fellow students when you were in college? What was it that they were driven to censor people about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely been different iterations. And one thing that the Coddling of the American Mind did such a great job of was describing for me something that I felt like I was living through as a test, study subject maybe, but couldn't really see the larger zoomed out version. And so to have Greg and John explain a lot of the safetyism of Gen Z was really clarifying for me, because I could see all the symptoms of it, but I couldn't quite grasp the cause of it or how it was different from times in the past. But I would say in the most recent couple of years, it's been the tying of psychological well-being and safety to words in a way that I think really appeals to some people's more sympathetic interest in saying oh my gosh, I wouldn't want to harm somebody or allow them to be hurt or wounded by words, and those words could literally be violence. And it sounds very hyperbolic, but that's discourse that I heard all the time at NYU, and feeling as though you need to protect another. And I would say, at least from my vantage point, I mean, I went to a very diverse college, but almost every single time I heard that sort of discourse invoked, it was by somebody who was saying, oh, we can't let like this other group, like we can't let these words wound this group. And I can't come up with a single time when someone said, like, as a person of color or as a woman, I'm wounded by those words. It's always to protect some other group abstraction. But I would say, at least in terms of the censorship inclination in my generation, it was totally just hijacking our genuine sympathy and empathy for people, and convincing us that insulating people or stopping certain ideas from coming out of people's mouths was something that would actually legitimately stop harm for others.
You mean so you're saying it's a mistaken belief that words are the equivalent of violence? Because if you really believe that, then there's kind of a rationality behind silencing people. You don't want to let somebody physically pound on somebody else. You would intervene.
Yeah, I mean, it quite literally, you would hear that, like, those are violent words, or you're harming me, or I need a safe space, which is an ideological safe space, but I almost feel like there's a physical element to that as well, obviously, in a very literal sense. But yeah, I mean, words are tantamount to violence in the minds of a lot of people that I encountered in academia, and I think that an outgrowth of that is, if you really embrace that mistake in my view, then it becomes perfectly acceptable to shout down a speaker, or to like threaten somebody who's trying to go to a campus event, or to assault somebody who's espousing dangerous words, because if words are tantamount to violence, then that's a completely acceptable response to them.
Yeah, and I always try to point out that this is an ancient idea, and I watch professors, most embarrassingly, but sometimes students think that almost like pat themselves on the back for thinking of like that. Well, we now know words are violence. It's kind of like, no, we knew words were violence back in the 13th century. Kind of there was not a major distinction made between the two, and it was more or less a societal decision to make a bright line decision, a distinction between words and violence. It's embodied in the First Amendment, for example. Took a while to realize, the full extent of it. It wasn't really realized until the 20th century. But at the same time, like this, Jonathan Rauch, who's a good friend and one of my intellectual heroes, he makes the point that it's underappreciated how much a bright line distinction between speech and violence has been a tool for peace. Because basically the way that the traditional way that we resolve disputes in human history is violence, or the threat of violence, or ostracism, like really coercive means. And to move from not just we're going to tolerate dissenters, but we might actually even listen to them, engage them, and take seriously the possibility they might be right, is uncomfortable. It is also like a radical idea, but it's one of the best inventions the species has ever come up with.
So the canceling of the American mind is something of a sequel to the coddling of the American mind. Is it that the coddling of parents, people like me, of people like Rikki, is what made them fragile, and that's why they're suffering? They have more anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, cutting, all this fear of missing out and fear of being left out and all that stuff? Is that thesis held up?
We, to be clear, in Coddling, we actually identified 6 different causal threads of why this happened, and parenting is definitely a part of it. Like anxious parenting is part of it. We actually even added a 7th, that essentially the ability to sort of fall out of the upper classes, has people particularly in the upper classes, kind of like in a perpetual state of sort of mild panic. But we also talk about how social media sped all of this stuff up, how the polarization made things much more intense. So there's a technological influence here that not only sped some of these existing trends like polarization and paranoid parenting up, also created some new ones, like, God forbid, Tumblr, where the social dynamic became very much about earning some amount of prestige by going in deep at the worst aspects of your own thought. So we think that actually this environment is created by a number of factors, but it is weird, the parenting, and I think that partially the actual, when I mentioned that the conservatives tend to live out in the country and liberals tend to live more densely packed, I think a lot of what we're seeing is this divorce between sort of traditional thinking and progressive thinking, whereas those two work really well if they balance each other out. That essentially, like someone pointing out, who really wants to be very forward thinking how they raise their kids, having the grandparent there saying, actually, some of that seems like a pretty bad idea, from what my grandparents told me. That's actually a pretty good balance. But now that we actually live in communities that are much more politically isolated and much more homogenous, we kind of spiral off in our own particular idiosyncratic craziness.
Ricky, how come you're not a fragile snowflake? What happened to you? What were your parents like?
She certainly is not. I got depressed and anxious while writing the book, and she was a rock.
I mean, I would say looking back, a lot of the Gen Z isms were things that it was helpful to have Greg and John kind of identifying some of the cognitive distortions of my generation, because I was guilty of a lot of them myself. But I think having that awareness and having, intellectual authorities like Greg and John who described that to me in a way that I took very seriously was something that allowed me to actually reflect in on myself. And I've met a lot of young people who've read that book and had the same experience, to their credit, which is why I feel so fortunate to be able to play a role in this next book with Greg. But I would say another part that was of my upbringing that's very important to me is I've been very fortunate in the combination of parents that I was blessed with a mother who is of Eastern European background and a lot of sensibility and no nonsense. And I think that's part of that kind of cultural inheritance. And a father who's actually 86 years old. So I've got the most unbelievable span of generations in one household. I mean, he was 63 when I was born. And I think coming home with a lot of the kind of generational tides of things that impacted me at school, and I'd come home and I'd police his speech about whatever word was perfectly acceptable the day before, but now I've been told by someone was unacceptable. He'd be like, I don't give a shit. Like, I'm sorry. I don't care. And
Ricky,
it was an anchor.
Your dad was 63 when he had you?
Yeah. So I was a late addition. And I think, growing up with someone who could tell me, I mean, I've always been a history nerd too. And growing up with someone who could tell me what it was like to see Nazi POWs with his own eyes being shipped to a camp in upstate New York, and who had lived through a lot of social tides and a lot of trends and fads that had died out. I mean, just having that, I feel so fortunate to have been able to ground my own conception of the world beyond just like social media or this moment here and now, because it was like almost like an anchor against some of the generational tides, I would say, in retrospect, for sure. I mean, I was like the only kid I remember one time in like second grade, a teacher had come to my mom and been like, "What's up with Ricky? She said son of a gun." And I've never heard anyone say that
Son
since
of a
the 50s.
So Dag nabbit. That's funny.
Well, and something really, my dad's actually was 50 when I was born, which is very unusual for people my age. And, like our family fled the Bolsheviks, like we were originally serfs, so we have a long family history of that. But particularly if you grew up in a first generation environment with or also with other immigrant kids, like the rest of the world, particularly when they come here, I think they have like a better understanding of some of the aspects of it that make America different. And free speech is always right at the top of the list. And how often, Michael, I have to tell you, like I'll have someone I went to law school with talk about being concerned about political correctness. And they'll mention or cancel culture or just ideology gone wrong. And even if they're otherwise very lefty, they'll be kind of like, oh yeah, my mother was born in Slovakia. Like they have some connection, or my parents grew up in China. Like they have some experience with authoritarianism in their family history or personally that makes them aware of how precious freedom of speech is. But that's one of the things that's so great about working with like a brilliant young woman like Rikki, is that, she, but partially by having, a little bit of a lifeline to the more distant past through her dad, she definitely maintained a tremendous historical perspective on how bad it could be without freedom of speech.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ricky, your dad's got me beat. I had my son at 62. He's now 7.
Oh, wow.
I just turned 69. Yeah. And I have a 31-year-old daughter. When I had her, I was 37, and that was kind of old. So, kudos to your dad.
People, I've been a great aunt since I was 10, so it's got to be like some sort of record.
That's really funny.
That's amazing.
Okay, let's talk about these generational differences. I've been thinking a lot about this. I just read Jean Twange's latest book, Generations. Highly recommended. Just an eye-opener.
Excellent.
Massive data set. So her thesis, just to review it for the listeners, is that Technology has driven a lot of social change, mainly, say, vaccines, public health measures, and so on, double the lifespan. If you lived in a time when you were likely to be half the population would be dead by age 35 on average, you got to have 10 kids because half of them are going to die before they get to reproductive age and so on. So we were a more what's called an R-selected species. That is, we have lots of offspring and hope to get a few into breeding age, like salmon versus elephants that have one or two. I mean, we're more like elephants on average. But her argument is that when life gets safer and longer, it can slow down. You don't have to have as many kids. You don't have to have them as early. Her startling statistic was that women of my age, on average, got pregnant the first time at age 19. Now it's 29 for your generation, Ricky. That's 10 years, and they don't have 4 or 5 kids. They have 1.5 or whatever. And so her argument is the coddling part. Coddling's not the right word. They're more risk averse because you're only going to have one. This is it. I'm putting all my resources into this one. And that translates into things like play dates that we do. Like, okay, I got to call, set up the time. We're going to drop them off. We're going to make sure everything is safe and protected and everything is good. Whereas in my generation, you have 4 or 5 kids, just come home by the time of dinner and that's it. Right. So the safetyism, she argues, comes from this kind of overprotecting and risk aversion because you have all your resources into just the one or maybe 2. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that makes sense even in the ways that I do think I was coddled. It was by my mom and being an only child because she, I was the kid that they poured all the resources into, and I would go to all the right tutors and she'll admit herself to have been a helicopter parent a little bit. And I think, my dad's first family, he had 4 boys, and it was like, I don't know which one's which at a certain point. They were 4 and 4 years. So it was definitely a difference in that sense. And I would also say, like, I think that the internet plays a role in that too, because of all this, like, I mean, such a wealth of a constant stream of information on like all these different theories about parenting and how you should be parenting and all these different methods, and there's this like constant stream of telling you what you're doing wrong with your kid or what you should be doing. I mean, I think that also puts so much pressure on parents to be giving their kids the best foot forward, and that often does mean helicoptering over them or coddling them or doing things that are historically just negligible to the well-being of a child going forward. So I think that probably makes sense, because if you have less kids and more time and a much louder bullhorn in your ear telling you how you're doing everything wrong as a parent, then certainly that would make you coddle your kids.
Yeah. And in freedom from speech, at first I called this problems of comfort, which unfortunately I realized would be, the initials would be POC, and I realized I might get canceled for that. So in Coddling the American Mind, we changed it to problems of progress. That essentially, and so I was trying to sort of split the difference about trying to explain why I agree, with Pinker on things getting better in a lot of ways, but also that I expect things to get worse for freedom of speech. And particularly if you have environments where you're, more isolated from people disagree with you, in a more therapeutic culture, and that has fewer, larger problems, and has a higher expectation of comfort, frankly, that you're going to get less and less comfortable with free speech over time, not despite other things getting better, but actually precisely because other things are getting better. So I think that the decay of freedom of speech is a side effect of what should be considered progress. I do think that if things turn awful, like if we end up in a nuclear war or something like that, some of that will go away because it tends to give people like a sense of perspective. But I would rather have the problems of progress than not have them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've often wondered if a lot of these big protests over small things are just the result of that's what's left to protest.
Mm-hmm.
That the big things have been the Vietnam War and civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. These are all done largely. And so what's next in the next generation? Well, I want to get out there and do something to help human progress. What's left? Oh, the trans rights or whatever, and our BLM movement. And and then also, when you watch something like the George Floyd video, I mean, it's really hard to watch and not just
it's awful.
infuriated. Yeah. And then you think, well, what can I do? I'm not a mayor, I'm not a politician, I'm not a police chief. What can I do? Well, I can go down there and protest. Yes, tomorrow afternoon we're going down to City Hall and we're going to have our signs, or you go on Twitter and complain, because at least you feel like you're doing something.
And I would also add to that, like in my generation, having been at a boarding school, like our school I think we were activated quite young politically, and they would have buses to certain protests and rallies if you wanted to go down to DC for whatever the most recent, like a climate protest or something like that. And I also think you combine that with the fact that teenagers are not doing any of the normal teenager things that they have done for the entire span of human history. Like they're not socializing, they're not getting outside, they're staying on their phones, they're not getting licenses, they're not dating, they're not getting summer jobs anymore. And so you have a bunch of kids that are on their phones and on their devices with a 24-hour news cycle who are kind of taking on the weight of the world on their shoulders from day one as soon as they plug in online. And they don't actually have healthy outlets to use their time. So of course they're going to want to put that energy and that activism and that passion that they have somewhere. And oftentimes I think it just ends up going into the political white noise.
Well, and let's be clear here, and this is something that I do. There's a tendency, particularly for those of us who are more left leaning, to never want to blame anybody. Like never want to say like anything was really anyone's fault. It's impersonal factors taking over, and that's the cause of everything. It's just you're a victim of circumstance. But we do try to be pretty clear in the book that there really was, for example, an anti-free speech movement. There really were thinkers, including Richard Delgado and Herbert Marcuse, and actually what gets labeled now as CRT. That really the first thing they did was try to pass speech codes and restrict freedom of speech. And it's the same thing that comes to like the theory of coddling the American mind is that we're teaching young people to think in cognitive distortions, exaggerated mental habits that will make them anxious and depressed if they have them. But to be clear, like some of that comes from, just parents being extra anxious as there's less to worry about. But some of it comes from a very intentional, movement among K through 12 teachers, parents, believing that if you're absolutely terrified and depressed about global warming, that will somehow make you more of an activist about it. And again, to go back to Pinker points out, no, that actually is likely to make you hopeless or come up with solutions that can't possibly work. What you need to actually fix things, like George Floyd, absolutely horrifying. And immediately, there were like 8 different reforms that would have made common sense to pass. It would make an event like this less likely. But instead, it became sort of a national consciousness raising thing. And it really, went after professors and students who tweeted things that were mildly, insensitive, even some cases like that are just utterly ridiculous. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate how much the mental health harm that we're doing to young people comes from a faulty belief that if we make them sufficiently miserable, it will somehow produce positive social change.
Yeah, sometimes you guys will hear pushback like you're just perpetuating a moral panic over much ado about nothing. This isn't a big deal. I mean, I heard, since you mentioned critical race theory, I heard Chomsky on a podcast the other day saying, oh, this is just this tiny little legal theory in law schools. Grammar school teachers, middle school, they don't have any idea what this, they're not teaching this to kids.
I have respect for Chomsky. He should know better. The thing is, it's not like they're not literally teaching. They're not handing out Derek Bell's books, but I mean, there's some of the books that have been in controversial. There's one I think it's literally called "Intersectional Baby," like anti-racist baby. Is absolutely that's CRT. A lot of these ideas. There's so much in the culture that people don't recognize that originally where they came from are Kimberly Crenshaw. Even though and Crenshaw has been critical of how they've turned out to her credit. But yeah, it's omnipresent in our society. It's so taken for granted people forget where it initially came from. Interesting books on different sides. Even though Chris Rufo isn't a big fan of ours because we opposed rightfully the Stop Woke Act in Florida because it was laughably unconstitutional. He actually wrote a pretty good book about the origins of CRT that points out that things that people should know, like Marcuse actually still in the 70s thought Mao was terrific, which is worth knowing. But also Yasha Monk on the other side wrote a book called The Identity Trap, pointing out a lot of this stuff and how much it actually has filtered in everywhere. And it is, it includes aspects of everything from postmodernism to CRT, and it's everywhere now.
On this topic of identity, Ricky, maybe you know some people, your fellow students, this kind of sudden spike in trans, bi, gender identity, fluidity, and so on. What is going on with that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a contentious issue, but I mean, it's one that
Yeah.
I have no problem talking about because I've seen it. Like, I mean, I draw a line between, like, I truly don't care. I have a ton of bisexual friends. I think that there is a crazy uptick in people that identify as non-straight. I It's not something that I'm really worried about pontificating about because, they're not hurting anybody. If they want to experiment or end up one way or another, sure, fine, whatever. Like, I'm very libertarian in my disposition on that front. I do draw a line on feeling as though I'm much more comfortable having a conversation about, like, when it comes to medicalization and permanent decisions that are being made, especially when someone is not yet 18, when you can't get a tattoo or even have a beer yet. And I think, at least from my vantage point, the people that I know who have gone down a gender nonconforming route, or who have decided to, or have ended up deciding that they're trans, have consistently been people who have been very online, and especially in crevices like Tumblr. And I think, there's a huge swath of historical data to demonstrate that young women are especially susceptible to social contagion. And I think that's a large portion of it, for sure. I think, it's just incubated in it's like a ready-made community that, on a place like Tumblr, if you're a kid who's kind of adrift in your social world, it's you're welcomed with open arms. I've interviewed a lot of detransitioners, and that's something that I consistently hear, is that they've felt when they were in middle school that they were kind of on the outskirts, and then all of a sudden here's this warm, welcoming community with a solution to all their problems, and that tells them that this is kind of the panacea to everything, and you get built-in friends too, and a whole world that embraces you. And then all of a sudden, all your friends in school in real life are celebrating you because you've done something so brave, or you're having assemblies in school, and suddenly you're the kid that was in the back corner, and you're really at the center of everything. And so I think that there's a lot of complex social things going on that front. But I would definitely say that the social contagion aspect, like, I saw it in, just from afar, in my age cohort, that there was definitely a propensity of friend groups, like, coming to that conclusion at the same time together. And I don't think that is a coincidence. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and I mean, and I want to bring us back to cancel culture and how it relates to this. So let's take Carol Hooven. Absolutely brilliant. Wrote a wonderful, like a really top-notch book called Testosterone, called T, and a dangerous time to be writing about it. She's an evolutionary biologist, and she's been essentially forced out of Harvard because she went on Fox News and explained very compassionately, very sweetly, that we should be respectful towards trans people, we should use their pronouns, all of this stuff, but biological sex is real, and that it's important, and we can't lose sight of the importance of biological sex. And immediately, a DEI administrator, started, complaining about her very publicly. Students got together and wrote petitions, to get her fired, or otherwise punished. And they wouldn't work in her class; they wouldn't be TAs, and she got really depressed. And she dropped out, came back again to work for Steve Pinker's lab, and given that she dropped out, we actually count that as a cancellation attempt in our database, but we don't actually count that as a successful cancellation, because she did it, of her own accord. But this happens all the time, and it's hard to know when it doesn't happen at a school as high profile as Harvard. But here's how this relates to the trans discussion. People aren't stupid, and when they see that someone got absolutely, raked over the coals for just saying biological sex is real, when the next expert comes out and says, actually, biological sex is on a spectrum, it's not really real, it's blah, 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 they're just going to say, why should I trust you? Because if you said anything else, your life would be totally messed up. You might be fired. You might actually lose your entire career and all your friends. And so that's one of the reasons why one of the subtler themes of the book is how cancel culture destroys trust and expertise.
Yeah. Yeah, just a final point on that, because I had a trans student a few years ago at Chapman who, 18, these are first year students, and she decided midstream, I want to be a boy or a man or whatever. But it was obvious in a few weeks she didn't want to change sex, gender, whatever. She wanted to be trans. The trans was the identity, not the other thing. And that's my sense of what might be going on there.
I think there's definitely also, there's so much pressure. It was really bizarre. I was in humanities classes at NYU, and there was so much pressure to attach your personal immutable characteristics to any point that you make as a preface in especially philosophical conversations, where you'd hear all the time, like, as a queer person, blah, 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 blah. And it would be like talking about some philosopher from the 17th century. And it's like, what does your queer identity have to do with that? Or as a woman, or as a person of color? Because it was almost like, if you felt like you might be saying something a little bit controversial, or your idea might be pushed back on a little bit, then you had to attach it to some sort of group that would shield you from it, which is almost the inverse of the perfect rhetorical fortress of what Greg and I discussed with cancel culture. It's like protecting yourself by saying, I actually am part of this class. And so, if you can adopt one of those classes too, then there might be social benefit to that in a world where people get torn down for not being the right identity and having a certain idea.
I remember talking to an uber liberal mother whose daughter, I think, just turned 15, and she was bragging how she's bisexual. I said, well, how do you know? I mean, she had sex with boys and had sex with girls, and she said, I like them both equally. And she said, no, she hasn't had sex with anybody. It's like, then how do you know? I mean, it's the identity itself. The word has captured this meaning.
It's interesting when you look at the data, like how many women say that they're bisexual, but when you actually ask them, who they have sex with, a large percentage of them only have sex with men. And it's kind of like, okay, so what exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
Although that does flip pretty considerably with Gen Z women. Jean Twenge has some data on that in her book, where actually a lot of the self-identified bisexual young women are engaging in sexual activity with both genders.
Interesting. Okay, before we run out of time, let's make sure we cover the conservative cancel culture. What's wrong with Ron DeSantis wanting to protect Floridian children and protect children going to Disney because they're going to be exposed to all this crazy woke stuff?
Oh, don't get me started on this. The laws coming out of Florida have just completely derailed some of the discussion, some of the very legitimate discussion about higher education reform, which, badly needs to happen. We need a lot of work to protect academic freedom and viewpoint diversity, and that overwhelmingly got derailed by the Stop Woke Act, which, literally, when they're arguing in court, I believe they said it's kind of like, well, you could have someone being anti-affirmative action in class, but they can't be pro-affirmative action. It's like, no, it's laughably unconstitutional. And we warned them about this. And now, because that was and Fire fought it in court, by the way, and we won. That there's now a version of it, part 2, that will, I think, is just as unconstitutional, and I think we'll be able to defeat it again. But it was bad because it's unconstitutional. You can't engage in viewpoint discrimination in higher ed, and it very much said you can't talk about these topics, whether race, sex, gender, but also really you can't have these points of view. It seemed to be it was baked into the law. And meanwhile, this has turned into, it's the new McCarthyism. There's all of these laws across the country threatening academic freedom. And I'm concerned about the bad laws coming out of a lot of these legislatures. But there really was, as best we can tell, one law that came out, and that's the Stop Woke Act. And we defeated it in court. But the other bad things coming out of Florida, like going after Disney for having a political position is just silly theater, but also abuse of power. The one that I think people should be more worried about is the attempt to go after New York Times v. Sullivan, which is the case that really strongly makes it very hard to defame public figures and well-known people. And it's funny because there's a little bit on the right that kind of like, oh, we'd be so much better off if there's no New York Times v. Sullivan. I'm like, guys, think this through. Who do you think would be the most likely to get in trouble without New York Times v. Sullivan? Like, conservatives are crazy to think that somehow protects them more than anybody else.
Just explain that law again, that decision.
So, New York Times v. Sullivan is a seminal First Amendment case from the 1960s in which there was a ad run in the New York Times where that talked about some of the racial justice protests going on, and it had a couple minor factual mistakes in it, and there was a lawsuit against the people who bought the ad and claiming that it was defamatory. And in that case, the Supreme Court came up with a standard called actual malice, that essentially you have to, if you publish something that you know was false, or you showed reckless disregard for the truth, you have to meet that high level in order to defame a public official. And this has been very good at protecting the U.S. from the very real problem of people in power using defamation law to silence their critics.
So this is like when Megyn Kelly had Ron DeSantis on, she pushed back against this, that this is not good for conservatives, because once you set that precedent that it's okay for the government to go after corporations' attitudes politically, well, that's just going to turn around and bite liberals.
Yeah, and I think it's something that unfortunately it appeals to like the baser instincts of people who may have been in the camp that I was in before I really sat down with like classical liberal text and theory, where like you see illiberalism on the left and people fighting in a really mighty way to try to squash out dissent. And then it seems perfectly logical, if you're not really steeped in the philosophy of free speech and pluralism and classical liberalism, to say, well, we should be stamping it out too, because we're fighting might with might, and they're bringing their fists, and we should fight back. And I think it's a really unfortunate reality that that's something that has allowed someone like DeSantis to get so much attention and so much popular support, because it actually feels like he's fighting the battles, and there's not enough, at least in my opinion, in my view as someone more on the right, there's not enough truly principled people with solutions that are genuinely pluralistic and genuinely foster a diverse democracy, that are coming up and saying, like, actually, if the left is going to abdicate freedom of speech as a fundamental principle, why don't we just take that up? And like, that would actually be appealing to quite a lot of people. But unfortunately, it's not quite as sexy as stopping woke. So,
yeah. Well, right. Stopping woke. I mean, there was a viral tweet last week of a photograph of a page from a children's book, maybe middle school, it's hard to tell, about anal sex, rimming, how to stimulate somebody, make sure you use soap and water, got to be careful of this and that. And this was just being passed around like, this is what the left is trying to do.
Yeah, that's a book called Let's Talk About It. Yeah.
So yeah, what's the backstory there?
The backstory there is it's a book that I don't think is appropriate for kids, but by a long shot. And this is something that is frustrating. Fire's coming out with a frequently asked question on book banning, and I put that in quotes because a lot of what's called book banning is not book banning, but there is actual book banning. We took some heat in the Wall Street Journal for talking about book banning in the book, but book banning is when you completely remove a book from a library, not reclassify it as for adults. You just completely take it out. Book banning is when someone gets arrested for giving, for suggesting the book. What is it? This book is gay, which has some racy stuff in it, but at the same time, it's not a crime to distribute it. And a lot of the way the media has been covering this is people are arguing that something is age inappropriate. And if you're saying if you have a process and they decide that this book is not age appropriate, that's always what K through 12 libraries and public libraries have done. And so there is a problem of book banning, but the way it's actually being handled currently in the media is really deceptive. The one that bothers me the most, frankly, is when you have these laws saying, we will not teach the following books in our curriculum. Well, and that get called a book ban. I'm like, you can think these are stupid, and some of them I think are stupid. But at the same time, do you live in a world where decisions on curriculum were at some point in human history not political? They've always been political. And what scares me the most with some of this stuff is that there's a movement among some nonprofits that are essentially just like the governor, the former Democratic governor of Virginia, just right before he lost, was really kind of saying that we should leave all decisions related to K through 12 education just to graduates of education schools, and it's like, no, there. I have 5 and a 7-year-old. There are kids. We pay the taxes on it, and this is a mandatory institution, and therefore there needs to be democratic oversight. So, when it comes to curricular stuff, that's always been politically decided and should have some democratic oversight. So I think there's been some, even though we object to the problem of book banning, I also think the debate has been held at a very low and sometimes, frankly, deceptive level.
Right. So you distinguish between public schools and private schools, for example. Private
of course, yeah.
Yeah, can do what they want, something like that, yeah. Okay, before we run out of time here, because I know you guys got interviews lined up, solutions. What should the average person listening to this do? What can I do?
Well, a whole third of the book is about solutions, but I'll let Rikki go first.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing that we do emphasize is on parenting. I think that we need to be very mindful to raise anti-cancelers, and that's something that sounds very like hopeful and wishful thinking, but actually the vast majority of Gen Z actually has a negative view of cancel culture more so than any generation. It's a small number of very loud and very vicious people who are tearing down fellow young people, and a whole lot of young people that are sitting on their hands and are afraid to speak up for their friends and to put themselves out there. And so I think that parenting the next generation to be mindful of the fact that like everyone is going to screw up and everyone needs some grace at a certain point of time is certainly something that gives me hope that there are more parents being aware of instilling those values, and a lot of young people who have come up, like raised their hands when I started speaking out in NYU and said, like, actually, I agree with you. Just don't tell anyone. Right. The problem.
Don't tell anyone. Right. So this is called pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else thinks something, and in fact they don't.
Collective illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when it comes to, I mean, for me, I think we need to be thinking about big, bold, other ways for the hardest working, smartest students out there to show that, because I think that's how kind of pessimistic I am about some aspects, particularly of elite higher ed. Now, first, I think people should hire less often from elite higher ed, because a lot of these problems are much more intense in elite higher ed. But I also think that we need avenues, that someone can show that they're, because right now, take Harvard, and I'll pick on Harvard all day. 45% of students, I believe, of white students are either kids of professors, kids of legacies, or sports people. And the average GPA at Harvard is 3.8. So you might have someone who just kind of waltzed in there because they're a legacy. That they don't have to work hard. They'll make it a 3.6. And I know this from Stanford as well. Like it's hard to be the top of your class, of course, but it's almost impossible to fail out. You can get away with doing very little in elite higher ed. So right now we have this product that's supposed to give us the hardest working, best and brightest, and it's not. And it's also giving employers in often cases people who show up and want to cancel anyone they disagree with and have, forums about, someone said something about conservative, in my organization. Let's have a giant meeting. I think that if we had some other alternate avenues, and I'm talking about University of Texas at Austin, for example, but even way beyond that, we need to have other ways of showing that completely go around elite higher education. Because that's how serious I think some of these ideological problems are. You need to find other avenues.
Rikki?
Yeah, I mean, to Greg's credit, he changed Fire's hiring requirements to hire me because I ended up just being so disgusted with the state of my education and the nerve of my school to charge full tuition for Zoom. And so now Fire will hire non-grads. He's walking the walk. And I think definitely challenging the grip that elite higher ed, which has inculcated all these ideas, has on our society and our institutions of leadership, is definitely a really important thing to chip away at.
And by the way, I think those kind of pressures will actually help encourage elite higher ed to reform itself, because let's face it, Harvard has I crunched the numbers the other night. $1 jillion its endowment. They're going to be around for a while. So you also have to put pressure on elite higher ed to reform itself. But I would love to start seeing people figuring out ways that people can show, how many books they've read on a particular topic, because those are the kind of people that at Fire, more basically, when we're hiring people, we're trying to figure out, would you defend freedom of speech even if it wasn't your job? And do you live and breathe this stuff? Because then you're one of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, Rikki, is it enough to say, I disagree with cancel culture? Maybe just saying it, other people go, hey, me too. And then all of a sudden you get a cascade of shifting of opinions.
I certainly believe that courage is contagious, and yeah, it's just a matter of I think, an example that I think is really gives me a ton of hope is in Harvard, their free speech council had 100 professors on it who all at the same time stepped forward and said, yes, this is a problem. And I think the safety in numbers is a really important thing, because they've not been castigated in a way that I think if it was just one of them, they almost definitely would have been. And so, the more people can actually put together that there are those around them that think the same way, which was my experience at NYU, having professors and deans and students that I knew and classmates that I never would have known agreed with me that free speech was an issue on campus, reach out to me privately, makes me realize, yeah, if we could all get together and say, this is a problem, and we're all going to back each other and be courageous, then I think that that's a really hopeful path forward. There's my 2:30. Sorry.
Okay.
Buzz someone
I'll
in.
say goodbye and just make a few more comments with Greg.
Okay.
Thank you, Rikki. You were great.
Thank you so much.
And congratulations on
you.
getting a major book deal with a major publisher at such a young age. You're just getting started. You're rolling.
Rikki is the best. I feel very lucky to get to work with her.
Thank you both so much. It's been a pleasure.
Bye, Rikki. I'll just a few more comments with you, Greg. I'm glad you guys took on The Bachelor and Chris Harrison.
Oh, yeah.
My wife and I have, we have a little junk TV we like to watch, which used to be The Bachelor and The Bachelorette.
It's great.
Yeah, and I always thought that was the stupidest show until I started watching it. Then you get attached to the characters, and like, oh, she should have picked him, or whatever. But then that last season where the white woman picks the black guy as the man she wants to marry, and then they do some offense archaeology, and they find when she was in high school, she went to like an antebellum. Like a
Scarlett O'Hara dance.
Yeah, Scarlett O'Hara. Yeah, something like that. And they, oh my God. And that those final episodes were just painful to watch. And they're like, why did you pick him? It's like, well, because I'm in love with him. No, that's not it. And it's like, you got to do the work. They kept telling her she has to do the work.
Do the work.
And that's the first time I had heard that phrase. It's like, what does that mean? Do the work.
It means I'm superior to you, and there's some knowledge that I have that you have. And Chris Harrison, what he came out and said in that was, let's have some grace. Let the people are being absolutely awful. Like it was something that was perfectly reasonable to say, and he got forced out after, what was it? I don't remember exactly. 18 years, doing it.
19 years. Yeah, it's astonishing.
Wow.
And he comes off as the nicest guy, probably uber liberal, just everyone get along and tolerate differences and so on. I mean, he deals with all that. And to be run out of town like that, it was just shameful.
Yeah.
And then they brought in that new host, a black guy, Ocho, I think ACHO or something like that, Emmanuel Ocho. He was a professional, I think, football player. Mm-hmm. And sort of trying to make the transition into television. So I read his book, which is basically, it's a little bit like the anti-racism type theme to it, where everybody is a racist. And I think the title was, difficult conversations with white people, something like that. It's like, So
that usually means lectures too.
Yes, yeah. So I said, all right, I'm a white guy. I have difficult conversations on my show with lots of people, so let's get them on. And the publisher, my publisher, Macmillan, and they're like, no, he doesn't want to do it. So, it was just like, I'll lecture to you, Shermer, but I don't want to talk to you about this because there's no conversation to be had.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's one thing that we do in the book. We talk about, things, cancellations related to COVID. We talk about journalism, publishing. We talk about corporations, because to make the point that this is really, escape the lab. And FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, where I'm CEO, we changed from being the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, focused overwhelmingly on higher ed, to to expression in just last year, because the situation has gotten so bad off campus as well.
Yeah. Can people who work in a corporation or at a university stand up and say, I'm not doing the DEI training? That's pretty risky to lose their job, right?
If you're in a private corporation, it's especially risky because they probably can, fire you for that. However, if you're in a university setting, and you say that I'm not attending this, there's a very, particularly given the way some of these are formed, there's a very strong compelled speech argument. Because a lot of times what they don't just want you to come to this thing, they want you to confess your evil or your oppression. Which brings up serious issues of conscience and compelled speech. So, one thing that FIRE is challenging right now, and I love this about FIRE, we fought and defeated the Stop Woke Act. We're also suing in California, going after this absolutely outrageous DEI policy that they have that requires professors, no matter what they teach, to work in ideas like intersectionality, anti-racism, all of the approved DEI type stuff into their classes. And it's like, and I watch some people kind of explode on threads, for example, where I am. Someone yelled in a response was, "Read a book, Lukianoff," and I'm like, I've read some books. But and I'd have to point out, listen, if you understood why it was a threat in the Stop Woke Act, this is actually even worse. This is telling professors what they must say, and it basically categorically eliminates the possibility that you come out and say, oh, by the way, I actually think some of this is BS. Like, it's actually required you to have a point of view on some of these topics. So we're suing it in court there.
So the constitutional legal precedence on that goes back to the saying of the Pledge of Allegiance for some Jehovah Witnesses, right?
Yes, 1943. Very good. Yeah, the Barnett case, which is probably my all-time favorite Supreme Court decision.
You can't make people say things.
You can't make people say things. And it's something that, and I say this, as bad as it is to tell people what they can't say, it's even worse to tell them what they must say, and downright totalitarian to tell them what they have to think.
And that it would apply to public schools, right? I mean, if I go to a Christian school and I want a Christian education and I'm supposed to believe in Jesus, they have a right to not hire me, Michael Shermer, the atheist, right?
It depends on what they promise. Like, we definitely do recognize that, like, particularly like a public, like a private Christian college, if it wants to not promise freedom of speech or academic freedom, they have the right to do that. We'll list them as a school. We call them warning schools. But what we mean by that is, like, well, if you want freedom of speech, it's not actually promised by these schools. So just be warned. That doesn't necessarily mean the environment there is terrible for free speech, but it could be. And they can do that. But what's interesting is a lot of these nominally religious schools have profoundly, strong commitments to freedom of speech in their policies, like Georgetown. And I almost wonder if Georgetown should just eliminate them, because they were third from last in our most recent free speech rankings, because they and it's not like they're firing people for being contradicting Catholic teaching, although that they are punishing students for that to some degree. In a lot of cases, like going after Ilya Shapiro is because he made the left mad, because he talked about how he was critical of Joe Biden's decision to say that he's going to hire a black woman to be the next Supreme Court. And something like 59% or some percentage of the American public was like, yeah, that was inappropriate. The person's always going to be it makes it seem like whoever gets the job didn't get it on the basis of merit.
Well, there you can just apply a Rawlsian original position where you don't know what the person's skin color or gender is. And therefore, you wouldn't want a rule that says I can hire a Supreme Court justice or nominate a Supreme Court justice who is X race and Y gender, because everybody go, well, no, that in principle that can't be right.
Yeah, I'll agree.
But if you fill it in with the correct race and gender to correct for the wrongs of the past, I guess that's what's really going on.
But I do apologize, because I actually
you got to go too. Okay, I'll let you go. All right, Greg. Yeah, no worries. I know you guys are busy. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure, Michael. And everyone should know that that Michael also appears in the book talking about some of the stuff that's been going on with Scientific American, which breaks my heart as well as a former subscriber.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.